When my sister got into debt, my parents cashed out their savings to bail her out. When I needed help covering surgery, my dad said, "She has a future. You're just a burden." My mom added, "We can't save you both." I just nodded and proclaimed, "Thanks for the clarity." 3 months later, I made a move none of them saw coming. Now they're blowing up my phone. "Please, just call." I, 29M, never thought my parents would hand me the blueprint for my own revenge. But that's exactly what happened 3 months ago when I needed emergency surgery for a torn meniscus that had gotten infected. The infection was spreading fast, and my insurance only covered 60% of the procedure. I needed $8,000 within 2 weeks or risk losing my leg. When I called my parents, desperate and scared, I expected the usual lecture about financial responsibility, maybe some reluctant help. What I got instead was a masterclass in favoritism that would change everything. My father's voice was cold when he told me they had already emptied their savings account to cover my sister's credit card debt. $23,000 to pay off shopping sprees and vacation expenses she had racked up over 2 years. When I pressed him about finding another way to help me, he delivered the words that would echo in my mind for months. "She has a future. I'm just a burden." My mother, ever the supportive partner, added that they couldn't save us both. I sat in that hospital bed, staring at the infection creeping up my calf, and simply nodded. I thanked them for the clarity. The tone in my voice must have surprised them because they both went quiet. I hung up and took out a loan at 18% interest to save my own leg. That night, as I lay recovering from surgery, something shifted inside me. I had always been the responsible one. While my sister bounced between jobs and lived beyond her means, I had built a successful consulting business, bought my own house, and never asked for help. Yet when I needed them most, I learned exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. The plan started forming during my recovery. I had time to think, time to research, and time to remember every instance where they had chosen her over me. The graduation money they gave her, but not me. The down payment assistance for her apartment while I scraped together my own. The constant excuses about why she deserved more help because she struggled more. My sister worked part-time at a boutique and lived in an apartment my parents subsidized. She drove a car they helped finance and carried credit cards they had co-signed. What she didn't know was that all those financial connections made her incredibly vulnerable. What my parents didn't know was that I had been quietly documenting their financial assistance to her for years, initially just to make sense of the disparity in treatment. The first phase was simple research. I spent weeks understanding exactly how intertwined my parents' finances were with my sister's lifestyle. The apartment lease they had co-signed, the car loan they backed, the 3 credit cards where they were listed as guarantors. I also discovered something interesting. My sister had been lying about her work hours and income to qualify for certain programs and assistance. During my physical therapy sessions, I started making calls, not to lawyers or debt collectors, but to financial advisors and accountants. I wanted to understand exactly what would happen if someone with co-signed debts suddenly couldn't pay. I learned about liability, about credit impacts, and about legal remedies creditors could pursue. The second phase required patience. I started a small side business, officially registering it and establishing business credit. Nothing dramatic, just freelance consulting work that I was already doing. But now it had official documentation, business accounts, and most importantly, it established me as someone with legitimate business expenses and income streams that would be protected in certain scenarios. 3 weeks after my surgery, my sister called to complain about her job. She was thinking about quitting to pursue photography full-time. She asked if I thought it was a good idea, completely unaware that our parents had chosen her future over my health. I told her to follow her dreams. I encouraged her to take the leap. I even offered to recommend her to some contacts who needed photography work, knowing full well that those contacts would pay much less than her boutique job. She quit 2 weeks later. My parents called me, panicked about her decision. They asked if I had encouraged her to quit. I told them I believed in supporting family members' dreams, just like they had taught me. The irony was lost on them, but I savored every word. With my sister now earning a fraction of her previous income, the financial pressure started building immediately. She began missing payments on the credit cards my parents had co-signed. She fell behind on her car payment. Her rent became sporadic. This is where my documentation proved valuable. I had records showing that my parents had been supplementing her income for years. I had proof of the $23,000 bailout. I had evidence of a pattern of financial dependence that any creditor would find interesting. Phase 3 was the most delicate. I needed my sister's creditors to understand that my parents were not just cosigners, but active financial supporters who had deep pockets. This required careful timing and strategic information sharing. I started with the credit card companies. Anonymous tips about cosigners who had recently paid off large debts and owned valuable assets. I provided account numbers, payment histories, and property records. I made sure they understood that the cosigners were not victims, but enablers who had consistently bailed out the primary cardholder. The car financing company received similar information, along with documentation showing that my parents owned their house outright and had recently liquidated savings accounts. Within 6 weeks, my parents went from occasionally helping my sister to being actively pursued by multiple creditors. The credit card companies were no longer willing to work with payment plans when they knew the cosigners had assets. The car company began repossession proceedings. Her landlord, learning about the financial troubles, decided not to renew her lease. My parents tried to negotiate, tried to make minimum payments, tried to buy time. But I had anticipated this. I had spent weeks researching their financial situation, understanding their assets, and predicting their responses. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I hadn't done anything illegal or even unethical. I had simply made sure that creditors understood the full financial picture. When someone cosigns a debt, they accept responsibility for that debt. When someone has assets, creditors have a right to pursue those assets. I had just connected the dots. My parents' retirement savings, the money they had claimed was gone, suddenly reappeared as they scrambled to protect their credit scores. They liquidated investments, borrowed against their house, and emptied secondary accounts I didn't even know existed. As their financial pressure mounted, I remained supportive but distant. When they called asking for advice, I listened sympathetically and suggested they speak with financial counselors. When they hinted about needing help, I mentioned my own ongoing medical expenses and business investments. I never directly refused to help, but I made it clear that I was focused on building my own future. The turning point came when my sister's photography business failed completely. She had been living in a fantasy, believing that artistic passion could replace business acumen and consistent income. With no stable employment and mounting debts, she moved back in with our parents. Suddenly, my parents weren't just dealing with their own financial crisis. They had a 30-year-old daughter with no job, no apartment, and creditors calling daily. Their house, once a peaceful retirement sanctuary, became a pressure cooker of financial stress and family tension. This is when they started reaching out to me more frequently, not with the dismissive tone they had used during my medical crisis, but with genuine desperation. They asked about my business, my finances, my willingness to help the family through a difficult time. I listened to their requests with the same measured calm I had used during my hospital stay. I acknowledged their stress, expressed sympathy for their situation, and consistently redirected the conversation back to their own resources and options. When my father suggested that family should help family, I reminded him of his own words about burdens and futures. When my mother mentioned how difficult it was to watch her daughter struggle, I shared my own experience of facing medical bankruptcy while my parents prioritized someone else's credit card debt. They started to understand what I was doing, but by then it was too late to stop the momentum. Their financial obligations were locked in. Their assets were leveraged. Their retirement plans were in ruins. The final phase happened almost by accident. My sister, desperate and depressed, made a series of poor decisions that amplified the family crisis. She tried to start a new business using her parents' credit, failed, and left them responsible for additional debts. She borrowed money from friends and family members, promising repayment from her photography income that never materialized. She made financial commitments she couldn't keep, using our parents' house as collateral without their full understanding. Each bad decision created new pressure points that I didn't need to manipulate. I simply watched as the natural consequences of their choices played out exactly as I had predicted. 3 months after telling me I was a burden, my parents faced a reality they had never imagined. Their retirement was gone. Their house was at risk. Their daughter was unemployed and living in their basement. Their credit was destroyed. Their marriage was strained under financial pressure they had never experienced. And through it all, I remained the successful, responsible son they had always taken for granted. My business was thriving. My medical recovery was complete. My financial situation was stronger than ever. The phone call started 3 weeks ago. First from my mother, then my father, then both of them together. They weren't calling to apologize or acknowledge their mistakes. They were calling because they needed money, and I was the only family member who had any. They started with subtle requests. Suggestions about family investments and business partnerships. Hints about temporary loans and short-term assistance. When I didn't respond with immediate offers to help, they became more direct. My father called to explain their financial situation as if I wasn't already intimately familiar with every detail. He described their mounting debts, their dwindling options, and their fear of losing everything. He asked if I would consider helping them through this difficult time. I listened quietly, asked thoughtful questions, and expressed appropriate concern. Then I asked him to remind me what he had said when I needed help with my surgery. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before he hung up. My mother tried a different approach. She called to apologize for their response during my medical crisis. She admitted they had made mistakes and handled the situation poorly. She asked if I could find it in my heart to help them despite their past behavior. I told her I appreciated the apology and understood that people sometimes make decisions they regret. Then I asked her to repeat what she had said about not being able to save us both. She started crying and ended the call. My sister called yesterday, screaming about how I had ruined their lives. She accused me of manipulating creditors and sabotaging her career. She claimed I had orchestrated their financial destruction out of petty revenge. I let her vent for several minutes before asking a simple question. Had I forced her to quit her job, max out her credit cards, or make any of the decisions that led to this situation? Had I made our parents choose to bail her out instead of helping me? Had I created the pattern of favoritism and financial dependence that made this outcome inevitable? She couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply removed the safety net that had enabled years of irresponsible behavior and allowed natural consequences to occur. The calls have become more frequent and desperate over the past week. My parents have left voicemails begging me to call them back. They've sent texts promising to make up for their past mistakes. They've even had relatives and family friends reach out on their behalf. But I remember lying in that hospital bed, watching infection spread up my leg, knowing that my parents had chosen my sister's shopping debts over my medical needs. I remember the casual cruelty in my father's voice when he called me a burden. I remember my mother's dismissive tone when she said they couldn't save us both. They're learning what I learned 3 months ago, that family love is conditional, that support has limits, and that sometimes the people who claim to care about you will abandon you when it's convenient. The difference is that I learned this lesson while facing a life-threatening medical crisis they could have helped prevent. They're learning it while facing financial consequences they created through years of poor decisions and favoritism. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not hurt or bitter or seeking revenge. I'm simply applying the same standards and priorities they demonstrated when I needed them most. They taught me that some family members are burdens while others have futures. They showed me that resources are limited and choices must be made. They demonstrated that difficult situations require hard decisions about who deserves help and who doesn't. I'm grateful for these lessons. They've helped me understand exactly how to respond to their current crisis. My phone is ringing again. The caller ID shows my mother's number. I let it go to voicemail, just like I have for the past several days. I'll listen to the message later, after I finish reviewing the quarterly reports for my expanding business. Because while they're dealing with the consequences of their choices, I'm building the future they once dismissed as worthless. And I'm doing it without their help, just like they taught me I would have to. The clarity they provided 3 months ago continues to guide every decision I make, including the decision not to answer their calls. Some lessons, once learned, change everything.